June 15, 1944, 0347 hours. Saipan, Mariana Islands. The acrid smoke of cordite hung in the tropical air like a funeral shroud, mixing with the metallic scent of spilled blood and the sweet rot of jungle decay. In a shell crater 30 yards from the beach, a young Japanese private clutched his shattered leg, his uniform torn and soaked crimson. The morning sun had not yet risen, but the flashes of American artillery illuminated his face in stark, ghostly intervals. His name was Yamamoto Kenji, though the Americans would never learn it. To them, he would simply be prisoner of war, number 1347. Kenji's breathing came in short, desperate gasps as he pressed his hands against the wound where shrapnel had torn through muscle and bone. For 22 years, he had lived by the sacred code of Bushido: death before dishonor, victory or death, never surrender. His father had drilled these principles into him since childhood. Speaking of the ancient samurai who would rather commit seppuku than face the shame of capture, the emperor himself had blessed this sacred duty. Yet here he lay, unable to move, unable to fight, unable to die with honor. The sound of approaching footsteps made him stiffen. American voices, speaking in that harsh, foreign tongue. Kenji's hand moved instinctively to his side, searching for his katana, for his rifle, for anything that might allow him to take one final enemy with him into death. But there was nothing. Only pain, and the approaching enemy, and the terrible knowledge that he had failed. What Kenji could not have known, what no Japanese soldier could have comprehended in those brutal days of 1944, was that these approaching Americans carried something their own military had never given them. Something that would shatter everything they believed about their enemies, about warfare, and about the very nature of humanity itself. The Pacific War had raged for 2.5 years by the time American forces stormed the beaches of Saipan. From Pearl Harbor to Guadalcanal, from the Coral Sea to the Philippine Sea, this conflict had devolved into something unprecedented in its savagery. Unlike the European theater, where the Geneva Conventions occasionally held sway and prisoners were sometimes taken according to international law, the Pacific had become a war without quarter, a struggle where surrender meant nothing and mercy was a forgotten concept. The Japanese military had spent decades indoctrinating its soldiers in the ancient way of the warrior. Bushido, the path of death before dishonor, was not merely a military code, but a spiritual mandate that reached into the very soul of every Japanese fighting man. From the moment they entered service, these young soldiers were taught that capture was worse than death, that surrender brought eternal shame not only upon themselves, but upon their families, their ancestors, and their divine emperor. They were shown photographs of beheaded prisoners, told stories of American savagery, and convinced that falling into enemy hands meant torture, mutilation, and a disgraceful end that would echo through eternity. This indoctrination created soldiers who fought with the desperation of cornered animals. When Japanese positions were overrun, entire garrisons would detonate grenades rather than surrender. Wounded soldiers would attempt to kill medics who approached to help. Officers would execute their own men rather than allow them to be captured alive. The Americans, in turn, learned to expect treachery from every seemingly surrendered enemy, and developed their own harsh responses to Japanese desperation. But within the American Medical Corps, a different philosophy held sway. These medics, corpsmen, and doctors had sworn an oath that transcended national boundaries: to preserve life wherever they found it, to treat the wounded regardless of uniform or allegiance. They carried in their aid bags something that would become a symbol of this commitment: the morphine syrette, a small tube containing a half grain of pure morphine, designed for quick injection to ease the agony of battle wounds. To understand the profound impact these simple medical devices would have on captured Japanese soldiers, one must first comprehend the stark reality of Japanese military medicine. The Imperial Japanese Army, despite its technological sophistication in other areas, maintained a medical system that was primitive by American standards. Japanese soldiers carried basic first aid supplies, but pain relief was virtually non-existent. The military philosophy held that enduring pain built character, and that morphine was a luxury that weakened the warrior spirit. A wounded Japanese soldier was expected to bear his agony in silence, to accept pain as part of his duty to the emperor. When Corpsman First Class Michael Sullivan spotted the wounded Japanese soldier in that shell crater on Saipan, his training took over. Sullivan, a 20-year-old from Boston, who had joined the Navy immediately after Pearl Harbor, had seen enough battle to know that wounded enemies often carried grenades, often fought to the death, even when mortally injured. But he also knew that his duty as a medic superseded tactical considerations. The wounded man was human, and humans in pain deserved treatment. What happened next would be repeated hundreds of times across the Pacific Islands, yet each instance carried the same profound psychological impact. Sullivan approached cautiously, his hands visible, speaking in the few Japanese words he had learned. Daijobu desu. It's all right. The wounded soldier's eyes widened in terror and confusion. He had expected immediate execution, torture, or at best a swift bayonet thrust. Instead, he watched as this American enemy knelt beside him and began examining his wounds with professional detachment. The American's hands were gentle but sure as they cut away the torn fabric of Kenji's uniform. Sullivan worked in silence, his face focused entirely on the medical task before him. He had learned early in his Pacific service that speaking could agitate wounded Japanese soldiers, who often interpreted American words as threats or taunts, so he let his actions speak instead, cleaning the wound with careful precision, preparing bandages, and then reaching for the small tube that would change everything. The morphine syrette was an ingenious American innovation, a single-use injection device that could be operated with one hand, even by the wounded soldier himself. Sullivan broke the metal seal and inserted the needle into Kenji's thigh with practiced efficiency. The effect was almost immediate. The grinding, bone-deep agony that had consumed the Japanese soldier's entire existence began to fade, replaced by a warm, floating sensation unlike anything he had ever experienced. For Kenji, this moment represented a complete inversion of everything he had been taught about his enemies. The Americans were supposed to be devils, barbarians who would torture and mutilate captured Japanese. Yet here was this young foreign soldier, treating him with a care and gentleness that surpassed anything he had received from his own military medical corps. The morphine itself was a revelation. His own army had nothing like it, no way to ease the suffering of wounded warriors. As the drug took effect, Kenji's eyes filled with tears, not from pain now, but from a confusion so profound it shook the foundations of his entire worldview. Everything he had been told about Americans was wrong. Everything he had believed about the nature of this war was wrong. The enemy who was supposed to be subhuman was treating him better than his own commanders ever had. Sullivan finished bandaging the wound and sat back on his heels, studying his patient's face. He had seen this reaction before. The shock, the tears, the complete bewilderment. American medics across the Pacific were witnessing the same phenomenon. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to expect brutality, were instead receiving medical care that exceeded anything their own military provided. The psychological impact was devastating to their carefully constructed worldview. This pattern repeated itself on every island, in every battle. On Iwo Jima, in February 1945, Navy Corpsman Robert Bradley treated a Japanese machine gunner who had been caught in an American flamethrower attack. The soldier's burns covered 30% of his body, and his pain was excruciating. Bradley's morphine syringe brought instant relief, and as the Japanese soldier felt the agony fade, he began to weep uncontrollably. Through broken English learned before the war, he whispered, "Why? Why you help me? I kill your friends." Bradley's response, filtered through a Japanese-American interpreter days later, was simple. "Because you're hurt, and I'm a medic. That's what we do." On Okinawa, the phenomenon reached its peak. The 3-month battle that began in April 1945 was the largest Pacific operation of the war, involving more than 1.5 million combatants and civilians. American medical units were overwhelmed not only by their own casualties, but by the unprecedented number of Japanese prisoners requiring treatment. Many of these captives were not professional soldiers, but conscripted civilians, teenagers, and elderly men pressed into service as the Japanese Empire crumbled. Hospital corpsman Daniel Chen, a Chinese-American from San Francisco who spoke fluent Japanese, became an unofficial interpreter for captured wounded. He documented dozens of encounters where Japanese soldiers expressed complete shock at their treatment. They expected to be shot immediately, Chen wrote in his diary. When we gave them morphine for their pain, many of them wept. They couldn't understand why we would waste precious medicine on enemies. The morphine syringe became more than just a medical tool. It evolved into a symbol of American abundance and humanity that stood in stark contrast to Japanese military austerity. Each syringe represented American industrial capacity, the ability to mass-produce sophisticated medical equipment and distribute it to every soldier. More importantly, it represented an American philosophy that valued human life even in the midst of total war. Japanese prisoners regularly asked their captors about the morphine. How could America afford to give such expensive medicine to enemies? Why would American soldiers waste time treating wounded Japanese when their own comrades needed attention? The questions revealed the depth of their indoctrination and the poverty of their own military medical system. The truth was both simple and profound. American industrial capacity had produced over 50 million morphine syringes by 1945, enough to supply every soldier with multiple doses. The cost was negligible compared to the moral benefit of maintaining medical ethics even in warfare. American medics treated enemy wounded not because they were ordered to, but because their training and cultural values demanded it. For many Japanese soldiers, this realization triggered a complete psychological transformation. Men who had been willing to die for the emperor found themselves questioning everything they had been taught. If Americans could show such humanity to their enemies, what did that say about the propaganda they had been fed? If American medicine was so advanced, what did that suggest about American civilization? Private First Class Hiroshi Tanaka, captured on Saipan with severe abdominal wounds, later told interrogators, "When the American medic gave me the injection, I felt no pain for the first time in 3 days. But more than that, I felt something I had never experienced from my own officers: kindness. It made me wonder what else I had been lied to about." The psychological impact extended beyond individual soldiers to entire units. Word spread through prisoner of war camps about American medical treatment. Japanese soldiers began to understand that surrender might not mean torture and death. Some actively sought capture when wounded, knowing they would receive better medical care from Americans than from their own forces. This transformation created a crisis within Japanese military ranks. Officers discovered that wounded soldiers were no longer attempting suicide attacks when American medics approached. Some were even calling out for medical help. The sacred code of Bushido was cracking under the weight of American humanitarian treatment. The Japanese High Command attempted to counter this trend through even more extreme indoctrination. Soldiers were told that American morphine was poisoned, that medical treatment was a prelude to torture. But these lies became harder to maintain as wounded Japanese survivors were repatriated during prisoner exchanges and spoke of their treatment. The morphine syringe's symbolic power grew throughout 1945. American psychological warfare specialists began dropping leaflets that depicted American medics treating wounded Japanese soldiers. The message was clear. America possessed both the power to destroy and the grace to heal. Surrender would bring not death, but medical care superior to anything the Japanese military could provide. Lieutenant Mamoru Sato, shot through the lung during the battle for Manila, survived because an American medic administered morphine and performed emergency surgery. Sato later recalled, "I had been taught that Americans were animals, that they would torture and mutilate captured Japanese. Instead, they saved my life with medicine my own army never possessed. They treated me better than my own officers had ever treated me." The irony was inescapable. Japanese soldiers, indoctrinated to believe that death was preferable to capture, found themselves receiving life-saving treatment from the very enemies they had been taught to hate. The morphine that eased their physical pain also eased the psychological barriers that had made them such fanatical fighters. By the summer of 1945, American intelligence officers noted a marked change in Japanese behavior. Wounded soldiers were surrendering in unprecedented numbers. Prisoner interrogations revealed that many had been influenced by stories of American medical treatment. The Bushido Code, once absolute in its demands, was giving way to a more pragmatic assessment of American intentions. The phenomenon reached its ultimate expression during the final weeks of the war. As American forces prepared for the invasion of Japan itself, Japanese military leaders faced the terrifying possibility that their own soldiers might choose capture over death if they believed American medics would treat their wounds. The morphine syringe had become a weapon more powerful than any artillery shell. It was destroying the psychological foundations of Japanese resistance. When Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender on August 15, 1945, he cited the enemy's use of a new and most cruel bomb. But for thousands of Japanese soldiers, the true weapon that had broken their will was far simpler. A small tube of morphine administered by an enemy medic who saw them not as demons to be destroyed, but as human beings deserving of medical care. In the years following the war, many Japanese veterans would struggle to reconcile their wartime experiences with their pre-war beliefs. The memory of American medics treating their wounds with silent efficiency became a cornerstone of Japan's remarkable transformation from bitter enemy to steadfast ally. The morphine syringe, that simple symbol of American abundance and humanity, had planted seeds of understanding that would grow into lasting peace. The tears that Japanese soldiers shed when American medics bandaged their wounds were not merely tears of physical relief. They were tears of recognition. The painful acknowledgement that everything they had believed about their enemies was wrong, that the Americans they had been taught to hate possessed a capacity for mercy that their own military leaders had never shown them. In those quiet moments when morphine eased their pain and American hands dressed their wounds, Japanese soldiers glimpsed a different way of waging war, a different understanding of what it meant to be civilized. The Bushido Code that had demanded death before dishonor gave way to a new appreciation for life, for healing, for the possibility that enemies could become friends. The morphine syringe thus became more than a medical instrument. It became a bridge between two cultures, a symbol of the American values that would eventually transform the Pacific from a theater of war into a region of peace. In the silence of those medical encounters, in the gentle efficiency of American battlefield medicine, Japanese soldiers discovered that their enemies possessed something their own leaders had never given them: compassion. And in that discovery, the seeds of modern Japan were planted, watered by the tears of soldiers who had learned that honor could coexist with mercy, that strength could include gentleness, and that true victory lay not in the ability to inflict death, but in the wisdom to preserve life. The American medics who worked in silence on those Pacific battlefields were not merely treating wounds, they were healing a broken world, one morphine syringe at a time. The echoes of those encounters would resonate for decades, shaping the post-war relationship between two nations that had once seemed destined for eternal enmity. In the end, the most powerful weapon in the American arsenal was not the atomic bomb that ended the war, but the morphine syringe that ended the hatred, a small tube of mercy that proved, in the darkest hours of human conflict, that compassion could triumph over ideology, and that healing could be the ultimate form of victory.